This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. One of the inspirations for this title, Questions of Courage, comes from an address that Rudolf Steiner gave to a group of young people already over 100 years ago, where he described to them that generally the constitution of the heart, not only the physical heart, but spiritual heart of people was changing so that they were more open and maybe more sensitive to orientations that could reveal spiritual truths, and that particularly young people exhibited this openness, and that this kind of feeling for wisdom and what might be right and what might not be right on a feeling level, really one of the big tasks was to not leave it at a feeling level, but to be able to think about it and to raise it, to have the courage to think clearly about what we might feel clearly as right. And Questions of Courage, in this sense, is really sets out to try to raise things that we might sense on a feeling level as true, as important, into clear thought to speak about it, think about it. And it doesn't really matter, I think, if we consider ourselves spiritual or religious. I think everyone who comes of age today or is coming of age today, we have a kind of natural, deep sympathy for science and materialism in our bones. And this leads to this kind of tension when we sense something spiritually that something in us has to acknowledge it as true. On a feeling level, there is part of us that really leans in the other direction very strongly, wants also maybe to reject it, to ignore it. So I'm speaking now, of course, for myself, but I think that that's a general characterization of our predicament today. And I'd like to talk about one instance of this today, and it comes from an exuberant writer in the English-speaking language. He was primarily a novelist, and his real arc of his career was about 1950 to 2000. And he was born in Canada, and a Jewish immigrant family, and raised kind of in an old European Jewish culture, and ended up, his family then immigrated to Chicago, to the United States, and he became one of the great writers of the English language, extremely influential, celebrated, and his name is Saul Bellow. And Saul Bellow is known all around the world, but he's most certainly not known all around the world as someone who had a sincere and dedicated interest in spiritual dimensions of the human being and the world, but also deeply dedicated to meditative practices and practices that he felt were connected with these kinds of understanding. That is not something that you necessarily will learn about if you look up the countless writings and interviews and videos about Saul Bellow. There is a professor of literature or a scholar of literature named Edward Mendelson who wrote an article called The Obedient Bellow. And he points out that this red thread, it is something very existential and essential in Bellow, who he is as an individuality. It's necessary to talk about it if you want to have any deeper understanding of Bellow. And if we shy away from this spiritual orientation, his exposure to Jewish esoteric imaginations from the time that he was a boy, but his avid study of Rudolf Steiner and of meditation. This is a quote from Mendelson. Bellow's most enthusiastic admirers, who celebrate his masculine style or his Jewish intelligence, are clearly embarrassed by this insistent strand in his writings, and invariably ignore or dismiss it, although his own emphasis on it suggests that their whole perspective on his life and work might need to be adjusted. So there we have one example from a scholar who acknowledges this. And, last year, someone gave me an article from the Frankfurt newspaper, the Frankfurt Allgemein, where there was a kind of summary of an article by a scholar named Kai Sina. And in this article, Kai Sina wrote about a book called More Die of Heartbreak, which is a novel that Bellow wrote in the 80s. And the main character is a botanist, and he's in the United States, and he is a kind of acknowledged as a genius, as a plant clairvoyant. And the book, which is, Bellow considered most of his work to be humoristic novels. The book is about this individual's, the tension between this deeper capacity to sense into kind of cosmic creative dimensions of plant life and his own personal sexuality and his inability to come to terms with that, and the tensions that lead to these ridiculous situations in the novel. And Kai Sina, he writes how Bellow was obviously pointing out that Middle European culture, and for instance Goethe, who is clearly the reference for this figure in the book, cannot really be a meaningful cultural influence for the 20th century in the United States. Now, for those of you who don't know, Goethe, besides being this real titan of poetry, not only poetry, but drama with the likes of Faust, and then, of course, novels like Elective Affinities and Wilhelm Meister. He was also a scientist, and he founded, actually, comparative morphology in botany, where he was studying metamorphosis. And it is true, Kai Sina is totally correct that in some way Bellow was inspired by this, by Goethe, with this figure in More Die of Heartbreak, his novel. But I don't want to get into the details of his analysis, but I want to give you more of an overview. This is a scholar, literary scholar, and he suggests that Bellow has written a humoresque novel where he's making fun of a kind of spiritually informed scientific orientation of Goethe, and showing how ridiculous it appears in the rough and rowdy tumult of pluralist United States reality. And that in this way, Bellow, and he gives a lot of different reasons I'm not going to go into here, is just kind of dismissing classic Middle European culture, for instance, as meaningful for the kind of life that he, as a Chicagoan and a modern member of the society in the United States, lived and loved. This is what I would like to suggest. This is the kind of picture of Bellow that Mendelson points out at the end of the day really has to be totally adjusted in order to understand, if you want to come into a deeper understanding of Bellow. And I'd just like to give a few indications of where this might lead, what directions for this. But it is amazing how you can come to this picture of the celebration of United States pluralism, the modern hyper-capitalist world, and this dismissal of, for instance, Goethe. There's almost like an enthusiastic tone. It's like Kai Sina is like enthusiastic about this atmosphere of modernity that Bellow is performing, and he's sure that this is Bellow's message. He's sure this is the message Bellow wants to communicate. Well, one of the things that we find out if we get to know Bellow is that he didn't look at his writing as messages, but instead he took different impressions, different qualities of people, of characters, and then he tried to work with them almost as if to create a musical kind of tapestry in his novels. And in the end of the day, when people would ask him, what is the message of this novel? It's interesting. He sometimes would affirm there was something kind of at the heart of it, but mostly his message was, it's a piece of art. It's something that should lead to a kind of joy and maybe a little bit of an ecstatic joy of beauty. It was a novel, and it was a humoresque novel, but he was serious about it. What was he trying to do with his art? So here's Bellow writing in the public, English-speaking public discourse. And what is he trying to do? To lift the attention of the public from distraction. He does this, quote, by opening another world. Another world, I am aware, carries suggestions of Never Never Land, and people will be asking themselves how seriously any man can be taken who still believes that the moronic inferno can be put behind us, bypassed or quarantined by art, end quote. And here, first of all, Bellow's referring to the distracted experience of American life as the moronic inferno. Okay, so just like, let's keep in mind this optimistic characterization of Kai Sina that almost celebrates the moronic inferno, or it's an affirmation of the moronic inferno. And what Bellow is now writing that he's trying to do when he writes. And then he writes, what happens when the writer does this? Quote, there is a recognition or rediscovery of certain essences permanently associated with human life. These essences are restored to our consciousness by persons who are described as artists. End quote. So here, I just want to point out that Saul Bellow is describing the vocation of the artist as allowing certain essences to shine through the work of art, through the work of art also being kind of a world in itself, and the kind of experience of society. Of course, that time, it's already 50 years ago in the United States, is a moronic inferno. But I'd like to now come to something that Saul Bellow wrote, which has nothing to do with the artistic creative process directly, but which has to do with the subject of this book that Kai Sina writes about, namely insofar as it has to do with Goethe. And Saul Bellow actually wrote the preface to a volume of lectures, an English edition of a volume of lectures that have to do with natural science. And they have to do with the need for natural science to pay more attention to what we could call is lived experience, first-person experience or phenomenology. And he sees this as connected to social problems and also problems that have to do with, in the West, in the United States, with a kind of superficiality. And in the last words of this preface, Bellow writes, quote, we cannot even begin to think of social renewal until we have considered these questions. What is reality in the civilized West? A world of outsides without insides, says Owen Barfield, one of the best interpreters of Steiner. A world of quantities without qualities, of souls devoid of mobility, and of communities which are more dead than alive. End quote. This is interesting because here we have in a work of nonfiction an introduction to a book by Rudolf Steiner, who is one of the most influential interpreters of Goethe's natural scientific work. And I'm not speaking about influential within academic circles, but actually in maybe more openly in civil society. And Saul Bellow is saying, until we can reach this kind of an orientation in natural science, the crisis, the social crisis in the West of superficiality, of materialism, and of emptiness can't really be addressed. So with these two examples, one from Saul Bellow's description of writing, the view of the United States kind of public discourse and experience as the moronic inferno, and his sense that a spiritual deepening of natural science was connected to the suffering, the extreme materialism and suffering of the West. When you compare it to Kai Cenat's, the image that arises through this article that was in the newspaper last year by, referencing a scholarly paper by Kai Cenat of this exuberant American from the United States who is dismissing Middle European culture and kind of romantic orientations to natural science as unable to inspire or influence modern capitalist society in the West. Wow, just so strikingly different. And in closing, I just want to now speak just a little bit about Saul Bellow's spiritual orientation, journey, connection to Anthroposophie. For those of you who might want to look more into this, really interesting individual. And, when Saul Bellow came across the work of Owen Barfield, when he came across the work of Rudolf Steiner, he recognized something that he already had a relationship to. And that is super clear. He's not someone who adopted something that felt external. And already as a boy, which he writes about in various contexts, personal letters, but also in essays, parts of his novels that are autobiographical, his experience of perception, like when he would see a person when they were walking down the street, he would see, it was almost like there was like an imaginative dimension to the way they walked. And he could see almost and feel like a quality coming out of their walk, that their walk itself was saying something to him, and like wanting to become a portrait in writing. And if you know Saul Bellow's writing, you know that there's portraiture throughout it. Sometimes up closes of just someone's face, but often how they move their bodies. And this sensitivity to a kind of moving and spiritual, and I'm speaking now phenomenologically, but also as a realist, as acknowledging a kind of spiritual life that an artist like Saul Bellow would perceive as well as with his senses. He's celebrated as a kind of master describer, a realist, but there's this spiritual dimension to his perception, which was so important to him and is super interesting when you consider his love of observation, which we see, for instance, in his masterful work of Herzog, but also he's always sensing this deeper creative presence of a spiritual dimension in perception. And that's what he was writing about in this preface that I just quoted from a few moments ago. And he writes about as a boy. Now, this is a quote from Saul Bellow. Quote, "When I was a very small child, it wasn't what people said, the content of what they said, so much as the look of them and their gestures that spoke to me. That is, a nose was also a speaking member, and so were a pair of eyes. And so was the way your hair grew, and the set of your ears, the condition of your teeth, the emanations of the body, all of that, of which I seem to have a natural grasp. That is to say, this is the way things are seen by me when they are most visible. I couldn't help but do the kind of observation that I've always done. It wasn't entirely voluntary. It wasn't based on ideas. It was the given." End quote. And here, how could we put it more clearly? This connection with the visible world that also had a subtle, creative, speaking component to it that felt so deeply connected with that visibility, the set of the ears, the gestures of the body. And it does seem natural if we get to know how Rudolf Steiner also experienced one of the ways that artistic inspiration naturally comes to people. He called it the sensible spiritual inspiration. And particularly for impressionists, this is always occurring. And Saul Bellow is certainly an impressionist. Namely, that in what is seen, something of a spiritual life that can't come to full expression, but can express itself in the inner life of the artist or the human being, expresses itself in the imagination. And that this desire, this kind of awakens a desire to be creative, to create an outer form for this life within the world, this excessive, overflowing life. And that is one of the reasons there's a drive to create art. And in closing, I want to just humbly admit that the few points that I have touched on here, I hope just give a living example of questions of courage. When you have someone who's so famous, so influential as Saul Bellow, who so clearly had this sincere, long interest in spirituality, which is dismissed in public scholarship or not acknowledged. We can really see this truth that to bring these realities into thinking, to have the courage to think about them, it's a big task. I've only touched on Saul Bellow's interest and connection to Anthroposophie and Rudolf Steiner's work. If you get the volume of his letters, one very moving and enlightening exchange that he had with Owen Barfield is contained. He also, of course, participated in study groups in the Anthroposophical Society in Chicago. And this was more than just to get source material for his book, Humboldt's Gift, where, of course, the main protagonist is an anthroposophist. But it was connected to his own sincere strivings and interests. So today, in this episode of Questions of Courage, we've looked at one example of the dilemma that the whole series is dedicated to in the figure of the remarkable writer, Saul Bellow. These episodes, of course, are a collaboration with Goethe Annum TV, and the production costs are very low. We give them out freely. We do invite you to consider to contribute to the Youth Access and Project Fund to support youth work around the world with Anthroposophie. And thank you very much.